So today is going to focus on engaging the audience and creating the outline. So remember, we are still here. Now we're going to be focusing on invention, arrangement, and we'll actually be starting on style. So we're still not finished with this. We'll be moving on here as well as talking about style too. So first off, when engaging the audience, it's really important to remember that a passive audience basically is a bored audience. I can tell you as someone who speaks in front of students all the time that the more you engage your audience and the less time they just have to spend sitting there, the better your speech is going to be. So going back to that rhetorical situation, it's really important to remember the audience. That's going to dictate how you want to be as a speaker. So when you're thinking about the purpose of your actual speech, that's also important when informing. If you want them to retain the information, you need to engage them. So how do we do that? Well, remember the purpose is to inform them, so you're becoming an educator. You want to develop learning styles. One of the most obvious ones for the speech is that you'll be speaking, they'll hear you, so it's an auditory learning style. The last lecture we talked about using visuals and other material. That's also effective. But what we're going to focus on now is using a tactile or kinesthetic learning style, getting your audience to do something. So how do you actually do that? Well, there's a few things. The easiest and kind of most obvious thing to do is ask a question, right? So if you have a statistic like 87% of students are sleep deprived, ask it instead of just saying it, right? Ask them, well, what do you think the percentage is? Or maybe put up a bunch of different percentages and get them to guess. Another thing, encourage interaction. So this is really especially important at getting the audience up or doing something. And there's a couple of ways that you can do it. One is pulling an audience. So instead of asking a specific question that you actually want them to verbally answer, you would ask them to raise their hands, right? So how many people here are sleep deprived? Raise your hand. Asking for a verbal response. So this is similar to a question, though you may just be asking for them to yell something out, right, to give you some sort of example, so that you can use as well. And then getting the audience to do something physical, and this is probably one of the most effective ones. I actually had a student who did a speech on CrossFit, and he got all the students up to do a really small CrossFit move. You can also call out specific listeners. So let's say you've been talking to someone in class about your topic and they said something that you want to use. You could maybe say, just the other day I was talking to Steve and he said da-da-da-da-da about the topic, right? One thing though, if you're going to call out specific listeners, please give them a heads up. I have had situations in the class where that did not happen and it ended very poorly. So just maybe before class say, hey, is it okay if I call you out or ask you to come up, do something like that. That's the other thing. So you can ask them to come up, you can get a volunteer. So maybe say you want them to demonstrate something or you want to talk to them about something specific. That will also be a really good way of engaging the audience too. And then the last one is humor. Now with humor you have to be careful. If you are someone who naturally can kind of make an off-the-cuff humorous comment, then by all means add to it. Humor is a really effective way to engage the audience. If you're a little bit more shy, then I wouldn't recommend using humor. You don't want to plan it out. But if it comes naturally, then by all means use it as an asset. Don't feel forced to though. As far as a particular activity, to give you an example, I had a student that was doing a speech on tracking devices and technology. And so what he asked the class to do was to take out their iPhones if they had it, and those that didn't have iPhones had to pair off with someone. Then what he did was he told them to go to settings, and after that go to location services, and then from there you could actually find locations, frequent locations, and it would pull everything up. And so this actually was really engaging. A lot of students were really surprised. This is actually me showing you what it would do on my phone. And the iPhone actually tracks everything. It will tell you where you were and when, and it'll even tell you the time. So when students were doing this in class, they were just shocked because they did not know this, and it was really memorable and a very effective way to segue into his speech. So anything that you can do that's really creative, that gets students involved, can be very, very effective, and not just keeping them interested, but really helping them to retain the information and understand the information, which is ultimately the goal of the speech. Some other things that we want to look at, I'm going to be showing you in a second some examples of speeches that actually use this. This is from the World Science Festival, so it's similar to TED Talks, but these particular speeches are actually science-based. So look at how the speakers, and there's two different speakers in this, use these kinds of techniques.
Talking about expectations. Watch. Ba, ba. Ba, 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 ba. Okay.
What does Disney have to do with science? Roller coasters. Who likes roller coasters?
This vest is equipped with an accelerometer and a data recorder, so we can get a live readout of the G-forces you're feeling while you're on the ride.
That's cool.
That's physics.
All right, let's get him in. Feeling comfortable?
Kind of.
Then you're not paying attention. Special effects. What do you got for us today?
I brought along a couple of special effects and thought this would be a great opportunity to try them out in front of a live audience. We're actually sending sound out at a frequency so high that you can't normally even hear it.
So obviously both of those speeches used a lot of the techniques that we talked about, and you'll notice that even in TED Talks and other speeches that we're going to watch, you have to involve the audience. It is really important because the longer they sit there, the less interested they're going to be. So keep that in mind with engaging the audience. All right, now we're going to move to arrangement. So this is going to be how to organize and set up your outline. So when we talk about setting up your outline, there's three basic parts, just like you would have, for instance, in an essay: your introduction, your body, and your conclusion. Very simple. I'm going to go through how to craft each. Now, introductions. There's a couple of different things that you need to have for your introduction. We already talked about focusing on the audience attention and interest, but you are going to have to do something specifically in the introduction to actually accomplish that. Connecting to your audience, putting yourself in the presentation, setting the emotional tone, and previewing the message. Now, how you actually do that, I'm going to talk about right now. So, first, you need to have an attention getter. This is what I'm talking about with getting the audience's attention, something that's going to hook them in. Could be a wide variety of things, maybe telling a story, using a really dramatic quote or statistic, doing some sort of activity. So you actually could use some of the techniques that we just talked about for engaging your audience. A thesis statement. So this is basically the main idea of your speech. What is it that you're going to cover? So make it clear to the audience. A relevancy or value step. This is going to be a statement that's going to tell your audience why they should be interested in your speech. And an ethos statement. This establishes why the audience should listen to you as a speaker, how you're actually credible. And then the last thing is a preview. Tell us where you're going. These are going to be the breakdown, the steps, kind of like the map of your speech, right? The different directions that you're going to be taking. So to first start with the attention getter, like I said, it's a hook, and it needs to be two different things, creative and short. So these are some examples, like I said, things that you could use: videos, quotes, statistics, jokes, pop culture references, props involving the audience. All of these things are really effective. However, it has to be short, especially for the informative speech. It can't be more than 45 to 50 seconds. So really get through it. Have it be something that's going to effectively introduce what you're talking about, but you don't want it to take too long. So I'm going to show you some examples of really effective attention getters so you can see different things that professional speakers have used in the past.
I need to make a confession at the outset here. A little over 20 years ago, I did something that I regret, something that I'm not particularly proud of, something that in many ways I wish no one would ever know, but that here I feel kind of obliged to reveal. In the late 1980s, in a moment of youthful indiscretion, I went to law school. Now,
I'm honored to be with you today for your commencement from one of the finest universities in the world. Truth be told, I never graduated from college, and this is the closest I've ever gotten to a college graduation.
We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, 221 years ago, in a hall that still stands across the street, a group of men gathered and with these simple words launched America's improbable experiment in democracy. Farmers and scholars, statesmen and patriots who had traveled across the ocean to escape tyranny and
I can't thank you guys for the opportunity. Let me tell you something. If tomorrow wasn't promised, what would you give for today? Forget everything else. Forget everything else. Forget that there was any sunlight left. What would you spend today thinking about? Yourself or the man that's beside you?
When I spoke here last winter, this nation was facing the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. We were losing an average of 700,000 jobs per month. Credit was frozen, and our financial system was on the verge of collapse. As any American who is still looking for work or a way to pay their bills will tell you, we are by no means out of the woods. A full and vibrant recovery is still many months away. And I will not let up until those Americans who seek jobs can find them.
So those were great examples of attention getters, and you'll actually notice there's kind of an overlap in what you do to engage the audience, right? So using humor, asking a particular question, and also using non-factual sources like the narrative that we saw from Steve Jobs. The other things that you want to make sure that you're doing in the introduction is not only get their attention, but make sure you tell them why the speech is important to them. And that's what you're going to be doing in the value step or relevancy statement. Give them a sentence that tells them why they should listen. In order to set up a relevancy statement, you need to think of 1 to 2 sentences that will connect the audience to the topic. So let me give you an example. If I'm doing a speech on BPA, which is a chemical that's a known carcinogen, in water bottles, I could say something like this. Most of us, if not all of us, use water bottles and plastic containers on a daily basis. Whether plastic is part of what you drink or eat, you should be aware of how the chemicals can affect you. Now, BPA in and of itself may not be an interesting topic, but I'm able to make this speech relevant because of the fact that I connect what the audience already uses. Here's another example, developments in surgical technology. Again, not everyone may be interested in this, so it's really important to tell your audience why it's relevant or valuable, which is also why this is called the value step. So, here's a way of doing that. While you may not be able, or you may not be going into the medical field, we all benefit from technological innovations for surgical tools. Who knows? Maybe one day these developments may save your life or the life of a loved one. So I'm connecting this basically on our need for the medical field. If you're not touched by it, then probably someone you know will. So having those 1 to 2 sentences is really important in telling the audience why this is something they should listen to. The next thing you want to add is ethos. So this is something that's pulling from Aristotle and kind of going back to what we've learned about rhetoric. Ethos is going to be the character or credibility of the speaker. For the informative speech, we're just going to be focusing on credibility, not so much character. That's something we'll get into later in the persuasive speech. So what you need to do is prove that you're a credible speaker, right? Not only do you have to get the audience interested, show relevancy, you also need to tell the audience that you're a credible speaker. They should listen to you. So you might be asking, well, how do I actually do that? Well, there's two ways. The first, establish a personal, professional, or academic connection to the topic. So let me give you some examples. Majoring in nutrition, I know the importance of a well-balanced diet. So here, because of your particular major, you can use that to assert credibility. I clean up the beaches every Saturday morning and have seen the devastation litter can cause. And having a family full of medical professionals, I can tell you how important it is to pay attention to your heart rate. So all of these use some sort of personal or professional connection that you have to the topic. Now at this point you may be thinking, okay, well what if I don't have any of those things? What if I just picked a topic because I thought it was really interesting? That's perfectly fine. The next thing you can do instead of using a connection is discuss the research. So there's a research requirement for the speech, and you can use that. Having extensively researched all the options for fuel efficient cars, I can tell you which ones are best. Now, this is one way of doing that. You don't have to use this exact formula, but basically asserting that you've researched the topic or that you're knowledgeable about the topic will establish ethos. So before we move on to talking about the body, let's look at an example of what the introduction actually looks like when you write it out in an outline. So this is an example outline. I have this one on my faculty page. I'm just going to go through so you can see how this looks when it's actually in outline format. So, attention getter, I'll read it to you. I decided to stop by the campus bookstore for a textbook a few weeks ago. However, 2 ambulances were blocking the entrance. A large crowd gathered to watch as paramedics carried a young man and woman out of the store on stretchers. After the ambulances departed, I walked into the store and asked the clerk what had happened. In a casual manner, he said not to worry, they'll be fine, that it happens all the time lately. A student goes to the register to pay for their textbook, the cashier tells them the price, and then the student faints. So they're using a very humorous narrative to lead into the topic, and that's typically where you have the thesis statement, right? That textbooks are expensive. This student in particular is going to tell you how to save money on them. Then you can go into the ethos. And one thing too, just to mention, so I have it as attention getter, thesis, ethos, relevancy, and preview. You don't have to follow that exact format. What I would recommend, however, is you do start with the attention getter and you do end with the preview. But how you organize this, so if you wanted to move your thesis up here, have your, ethos right here, that's fine. You don't have to move these in any particular order. It's just typically it's best to start with your attention getter and then to end by telling us where you're going to be going. So ethos, remember, this is your credibility. So he's saying he can relate, obviously because he's a college student, so that's a personal connection. But he also does the second thing I mentioned, which is talk about his research. You don't have to do both, just one of these will suffice. Relevancy step or relevancy statement, or value step, this is just saying how the audience can relate, and I gave you 2 example statements. This student is actually using research. That's fine to use as well. There's a lot of different options, so remember, these examples I'm giving you are not the absolute way that you have to do them. There's some flexibility here. So he says textbook have been cited as actually one of the top 2 factors for not completing college. And then the last one, previewing the main point, he gives a little bit more information here. You don't have to do that. Really all the preview is this. Tell me what your points break down to. I like to think of the preview as sort of your map or your directions of the speech, right? And you're going to be the guide leading them through. So first you're going to go here, then you go here, and then you'll be ending here. That's kind of an easy way to think of the preview. So that's how it's going to be looking when you set up your introduction. Now, when moving on to the body of the speech, this has less specific steps. There are a few things that I am going to require. One is you have to break down your points into a topical order. Now, by topical order, this just means you have to choose a way to break it down. The example outline that we saw with the preview, he broke it down to where to buy your books, how to rent your books, and then how to sell them back. So that's kind of the process in which you would do that. So it's really up to you just to choose it, but you have to break it down so that we have specific topics. The other thing, it has to be in full sentences. And let me emphasize, I know I've said this before, if you don't want to use the outline that you're turning into me, that's perfectly fine. You can use something else, but what you give to me has to be in full sentences, just so I can see what you had planned on and then I can more accurately grade you. You also must add development to your points. I'm going to show you what that looks like in a second, and you don't have to specifically follow the form. So how do you actually set it up once you're writing the outline? So pretend, first off, that this is already filled out. Now, if I'm doing the body, I would want to start with my first point. Now, my speech is going to be on how to actually write a speech. So the first part would be the first thing to do in the body is pick a point. So let's say this is my actual point. Then I need to develop it. So remember I mentioned you have to develop your points. The development is where you're going to add in your sources, your non-factual sources, a way to engage your audience, or just additional information. So I'll put picking your points is all about dividing them effectively. Now I could maybe add a source. So according to the New York Times, I'm using a shorthand here, speeches that divide points are good, whatever. And I would probably actually put that under this, since this is, material specifically for that point. And then I could probably do a non-factual example. I'll do, a friend of mine had a terrible speech because it wasn't divided well. And then maybe I could go on to another point. So here that would just probably move over and indent. So notice I'm using Times New Roman, A and 1. You don't have to specifically do that, and that's what I meant by not following the format. It's really just spatially, so see how it's really kind of easy to follow. Okay, these develop that, this develops that. That's what I'm looking for more so. Okay, next you need to highlight the points, right? And then the same kind of thing. Maybe here I might engage the audience, right? Ask them a question. And I'm just going to type question for shorthand. Maybe I could use another source, right? Maybe something from a database. Same thing, I'm kind of using a shorthand. And then let's say I'm done with this, right? So now I want to move on to my next point. Whenever you are using indents, by the way, you can just go up here, decrease indent. It's always on the home. And just keep going, and then I can go into my second thing. So next I need to research. That's important. So I would put go to database, and then some point on the database. This is through Panther Web, right? So this is really what I'm looking about when I'm talking about development. What I would recommend for students, the typical order is probably start with a factual source, then add material, like probably your own words, to describe it. Then I would recommend using a non-factual, and then probably engaging the audience. So the goal for the outline is in each point, you probably want to do these things over here. These would be the goals for the outline. Factual, describe it, non-factual, engaging. You don't have to do that in that order, but that's kind of what you want to be doing in each point to really develop what you have. To go to the example outline so you can see what this looks like when you're creating it, remember his first point, and this is actually from the preview, where to buy the book. So buying textbooks, right? He kind of states that here. And then he just starts, right? Convenience, reliability. That's what a lot of students do. He brings in a survey that he conducted, which is an example. He brings up some more examples about Amazon, Chegg, different things. And then he has a factual source in here. This is what he took from a book, and then he has another factual source. So notice he's actually not even following that format that I mentioned you could use of sort of factual, your own words, non-factual, engaging. That, once again, is just a recommendation. You don't have to do that. So keep in mind, I want you to do what you feel most comfortable with, what you feel works best for the speech. Then, and this is one thing I didn't talk about, is he has a transition. In class, we're going to talk about techniques for transitions, so you don't have to worry about that right now. Then he moves on to his second point, so the way you can borrow and rent. So this time he actually starts, right, with more factual material and a quote. Then he gives an example, and then he kind of ends with his own words. Last point, so this is about selling them back, factual material, and kind of his own words. Right here you can kind of see many students, especially new ones, don't really know about this, and then he kind of adds into that. This is his own material, and then just giving some examples here, and then kind of ending that way. So that's how the outline looks. It's just going to be a brief overview of where you're going in your speech. And remember, spatially, that's what I'm looking for. It's, he's using A in one. He's not using the Roman numerals throughout. That's perfectly fine as well. Another important part of the speech is the conclusion. And one thing I find of the conclusion is students usually miss this as an opportunity for really effectively ending their speech. So a lot of times students will be so relieved that they finish that they'll say things like, "I'm done," or "Okay, that's it." No, that's not it. You need a conclusion. So let me just make that clear. You have to actually effectively conclude your speech. So to do that, here's what you want to do. 1, be memorable, right? End with impact. You start with an attention getter. You kind of want to end with an attention getting sort of device. You also want to be clear. You just spent 4 to 6 minutes talking to your audience. Tell them what they were supposed to get from the speech. And most importantly, be brief. Here I'm saying don't go beyond 2 minutes. Especially for this speech, I would really say 1 minute. In the speeches that we get later on, definitely 2 minutes would be more effective, but here just 1. So, some ways that you can actually conclude. You could use a quote, a narrative, call for action, or refer to the beginning. So basically, if you want to refer back to your attention getter, what you started with, and kind of, if it's maybe a story, refer to it and end the narrative, that's fine. And of course, the quote and narrative, by the way, are non-factual sources. You are going to have non-factual sources in your speech, so if you didn't have them in your introduction or in your body, you can always use them in the conclusion. So let me give you an example. If you read this right here, try and guess which particular technique this is. Okay, so if you guessed it's quoting someone, that would be correct. So this is one way of ending with impact, and obviously this is a very famous quote. Let me give you another example. So capital punishment does not deter crime, but it does kill the poor, innocent, and disenfranchised, and it will never bring back the innocent dead. It is time to abandon revenge and honor life. So, this is a call for action. One thing to remember, call for action is especially effective for an argumentative or persuasive speech. You want to be careful in the informative speech of using this. So some of these other techniques may be a little bit more effective for this speech. So how does a conclusion look when you have it in an outline? Well, it's not that long. It's probably a couple of sentences at the most. You want to kind of refer back to what you were talking about, right? So the speech was basically being an educated consumer, right? Don't buy books that are really, really costly. There's no point in doing it. You're already paying enough for college. And then he kind of reviews what he said before. Now, if you're doing it when you're writing it in the outline, 2 things that I mentioned, right? Something to end with impact, and then sort of reviewing your thesis. That's really what you want to do. That's all you have to do in the conclusion. The conclusion is probably the thing you should spend the least amount of time on. However, remember, you do need an actual conclusion. I can't emphasize that enough. Another thing to remind you of is on my faculty page, if you click on Format of Outline, you will actually get a sheet that will pull up just like this, and it will give you all of the things that you need. So I have students who will actually just erase this, and they will just literally type into it because it pulls up as a Word file. And just to mention, like I said before, right, I have in-depth analysis and supporting evidence. You don't have to follow that exact format. It's just really spatially that I think it's important that you do that. So this you can use just in case you're having some formatting trouble, but remember, you don't have to follow it exactly. Alright, so that is it. As far as homework, 1, you need to create a preview for your speech. Just to remind, so the preview is going to be the breakdown, right? What specific points are you going to be covering? So this is part of why I already made you do some research. You should start to see what aspects of your speech you're going to cover, and you may actually have to do a little more research. Keep in mind too, you want to have access to your sources, so bring those to class. You don't have to have them printed up, but if you can have some sort of digital access, we will be working with your sources next time, and you'll need them to create your preview. In addition, you will need to answer what is 3 of the 5 requirements of the introduction, what do you need in the conclusion, so just tell me what you actually need to do, what is ethos, and then also create your own ethos statement. So like I said before, we're going to work on starting to craft these outlines. So these things you'll be doing in homework, and in class we'll work on adding more to them. And then the last thing, what 2 canons did this lecture focus on? So these are the questions you need to answer, but it's especially important that you do these 2 things, that you create your ethos statement. So remember, why are you credible on the speech? So I kind of just answered the first question for you. And then the preview of your speech, how are you going to break it down?